This is Cliff Sarantine. It's January 14th, 2018. Time is roughly 14:30 hours. I'm at the head of a vast pulp plantation, which appears to cover many square miles, at least 10, probably more. And I'm going to survey the wildlife traffic by walking roughly 1 mile up this back road and observing for any tracks that are crossing the road. Now, there are some diversified woodlands roughly 3/4 of a mile that way, which is due north. There's also a lake over there, so I expect I may get a bit higher traffic than normal. We're not looking for direct sightings of wildlife, but rather spoor, in particular droppings and prints. We'll walk roughly 1 mile up this trail, then double back, simply counting everything that we come across. Here's our first bit of spoor right here. May not show up all that well due to the low contrast provided by the shallow snow. This is spoor of a wildcat. This is spoor of coyote. And it appears to have recently eaten a meal consisting of flesh. I'm not going to dig into it to see particularly what it ate. That is spoor 2. I'm labeling this one 2A, as this is the same wildcat that I spotted earlier. Spoor 2B, this is the same wildcat picked up about 500 yards later. I'm roughly 500 yards into this pulp plantation so far, still walking roughly due east down this extremely rarely used logging road in country that should be wild. It's about 10 miles from the nearest main road. You can't hear any activity back here whatsoever. It's because there's nobody back here, not for miles. And there's almost no wildlife activity. The only wildlife activity I've come across is a single bobcat and a single coyote right at the edge of where the pulp plantation begins. And the bobcat is distinctively heading out of the plantation. As far as the coyote, all I found was feces spoor, and that doesn't tell me what direction the coyote was going, and I can't quite be sure how old it is, except that it was probably left within 24 hours, since the last 2 days it was pouring rain and it was quite warm, which would have degraded the feces more than it appeared to be. This is excellent, almost perfect conditions for tracking. We have a fresh, thin dusting of snow over hard frozen ground. It's like a blank sheet. Any spoor available should be readily visible. Not much is going to be missed. And mobility is easy. Spoor 3-sided, roughly 1,000 paces or 1,000 yards in. This is the spoor of a red squirrel that was darting across the road. More than half a mile in, I've counted 3 spoor. 1 coyote at the edge of the plantation, 1 bobcat at the edge of the plantation, and 1 red squirrel. 1,100 paces or yards in. And here we have spoor. And here we have spoor of a porcupine. This is spoor sighting 4. I sighted the porcupine tracks only about 10 paces up from where I sighted the red squirrel tracks. And my guess would be that's our red squirrel just over there. You might be able to hear it. I don't know if the mic gets enough directional gain to pick it up. It's probably 5 to 10 yards off the road. That is the first squirrel. This is the first sign of any type of activity of any animal, apart from a few tracks that I've encountered, in roughly 1,100 paces, or 1,100 yards, getting close to the mile mark here. I'm very disturbed that I've now very nearly reached my goal in terms of how much I intended to travel within this pulp plantation, and I've yet to see any sign of deer whatsoever. I'm not surprised, though I'm disturbed. I've seen no feces. I've seen no broken, angled sedges or grasses or anything that might indicate the feeding of a large herbivore. I've seen no evidence of white-tailed deer in here whatsoever. Now that's not surprising. Look at this ground. Spruces. Nothing but spruces with the odd birch, the odd miscellaneous shrub. Looks like willow right there. There just isn't really anything here that a deer could call food, especially not for the winter. There are no ferns for it to dig up from under the ground. Some sphagnum moss over there. There's just nothing that a large herbivore such as a deer or a moose would require. Here we have very good tracks of our wildcat. Yeah, this is definitely the same animal. It was passing through here. It's a very straight course it's taking. It's just following this path. And it's following a pretty direct course right out of the Pulp Plantation. Now, as a tracker, I could hazard a pretty educated guess why that is. There's nothing for it to eat in here. There's not even spores, no shoe hares. No deer, no hares, one red squirrel, one coyote, one bobcat on its way out. You're wondering how remote this territory is. I'm going to just film behind me. You can see the hills and woodlands going on for miles off in that direction. I'm near the top of a hill here. You're seeing several miles that way. I'm in a pretty remote area. This remote area is predominated by Pulp Plantation. And as is so often the case in Pulp Plantations, it's devoid of life. Well, I'm coming to the end of the survey through the Pulp Plantation. The cold killed the battery on my cell phone that I was using for a timepiece. So my original plan had been to walk for 20 minutes, deducting the amount of time that I had to stop to examine Spoor and calling that roughly a mile. Since the timepiece failed, I had to go by a pace count, and I hiked 1,500 paces. That'll be just under a mile. A mile's about 5,000 feet. 1,500 paces is 4,400 to 4,600 feet, depending on whether or not you're walking uphill or downhill. It's a little hilly back here, but fairly level overall. I have a large pace, just under 3 feet per step when I'm moving fast, and it won't vary much over terrain like this. I'll use the same method for fairness sake when I get to the healthy woodland and begin the survey there. Fortunately, while I did not bring a backup battery with me for this camera, I did bring a backup camera. So even though the cold is getting to this one, I have the other one and the nice warm vehicle that I can fall back on. Coming back from surveying the Pulp Plantation, I encountered this. This is responsible forestry, according to Northern Pulp and Forest, Nova Scotia. What you're seeing almost a mile away is roughly a square mile of old-growth hardwood forest that's all been clear-cut. You can see the forest continues beyond this last bit of spruce plantation here. Undoubtedly, that'll all be replanted with spruces. I can see they left some of the spruces standing in there, but you can see the deep, deep treads of the heavy machinery that went in there and scarred the ground, broke the rock, created tons of erosion on that relatively steep hillside. No place in Nova Scotia is our forest safe from the depredations of Forestry Nova Scotia and Northern Pulp. As the viewer can see, this is a very different kind of country. We're going to go 1,500 paces through these woods and see what wildlife we can document here. A simple survey count. Spoor sighting A. This appears to be red squirrel crossing this old road. This is a leftover logging road as well, sometimes used during the summer, rarely though. almost never during the winter. This is my backup camera. The cold killed the battery, so I have to use this one very conservatively. There's only an hour left of light, and I'm not sure what the temperature is now, but I can certainly feel that it's getting lower pretty rapidly. So there'll be less narration. I'm just going to reserve the camera for counts. That was sighting 1, red squirrel. Sighting 2, red squirrel. Sighting 3, this is a small rodent, possibly a vole, perhaps a shrew. Not really good with the tracks of the small rodents, so I can't say for sure. There are tracks here, again of red squirrel, crossing this path. He's loping along. That's sighting 4. Right here we have the track of a snowshoe hare. Right here we have the tracks of a creature I can't quite identify. The tracks are a bit too mangled up. That's sighting 5, 6. The beta camera, a GoPro, doesn't have as good a directional mic and no zoom at all. But just over there, just off the road, there are a pair of black-cap finches, 7 and 8. Just over here, there's another black-cap finch. That's sight 9. Just over here, the call of another bird. I didn't recognize that one. We're encountering so much more life, so much more thickly, and so much more diversified in this healthy woodland. Another sighting looks to be a vole emerging from the subnivean area below the snow. This is sighting 10. Unfortunately, the heavy rains that had occurred for 2 days before this hard freeze had caused the brook that ran alongside the old logging road to overflow its banks, and it had flowed over the road in some places quite deep and frozen, forming very slippery and treacherous ice with a thin shell that was easy to break through in places and too hazardous to cross. A steep incline on the far side of the road made it impossible to get around, so I had to stop at 900 meters in. So we will have to extrapolate based on the number of spoor sightings so far to determine how many might have been there. But as you can see, even without this extrapolation, the healthy biodiverse forest hosts much more fauna than the Pulp Plantation. In fact, the bobcat sighted in the Pulp Plantation was merely passing through. Apart from the coyote spoor, which was only sighted at the very edge of the plantation, within only an odd red squirrel and a porcupine were sighted. The healthy forest, on the other hand, was rich in a diversity of wildlife.